we just performed for you a samai, which is a traditional form that we play all the way from Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and Egypt. So this is a common form. It's kind of meditative, and it has four parts. The performance was on the following instrument: the Arabic riq, which is the tambourine, the nai with Dr. Racy, which is the end-blown flute, the oud, one of the most central Middle Eastern instruments, and the forerunner of the European lute, the violin, which we are going to talk about a little bit later, with Leif, and welcome to Karim. So today we have a panel of musicians, very talented musicians, composers, researchers, educators, and we are going to exchange or to talk about a few elements that constitute the music in the Levant area. And the Levant has been a fertile ground for cultural blending and exchange that started in the 7th century, where art in the region was met with that of Syria, Mesopotamia, Byzantium, and Persia. Later, there was great exchange, of course, with the 400 years ruling of the Ottoman Empire over the Levant and North Africa and other regions. Still, there was a fantastic exchange of music, exchange of music theory, exchange in music forms. And then in the 19th century, early 19th century and 20th century, we had An-Nahda, the cultural renaissance that began in Egypt and moved to the Levant, including Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, included a region-wide musical renaissance. Western musical instruments and musical notation were introduced. String instruments such as the violin and the cello integrated with the traditional music ensemble. Musical theater grew and flourished. Egyptian and Syrian musicians introduced Arabized European works in the form of operettas, and that included comedy, music, and dance. Pioneered by one of the most productive and talented composers, musicians at that time, Sayyid Darwish of Egypt, the Rahbani brothers and singer Fairuz produced musicals in Lebanon and Syria that were based on folk themes from rural Lebanon. Cinema followed on the footsteps of musical theater. Musical films helped to spread the music to a larger audience in the Near East, Europe, and the United States. Musicians who carefully presented Arab traditional vocal and instrumental music in their films experimented by fusing Arab melodies with Western rhythms and orchestration. For example, you will listen to Muhammad Abdul Wahab or Farid al-Atrash of Syria, infusing their own traditional forms and rhythmic patterns with Western rhythmic modes, such as tangos and the waltz that was highly performed at the time. Today, traditional music of the Levant plays a major role in defining culture and heritage. While close cultural music pollination has created a perfect alchemy for music to transcend the boundaries of genre and geography. Today, our panel will discuss several key aspects of a rich music of the region, its formative past, current practice, and future vistas. And instead of going back to ages, I would like to start with this interesting period of the 19th, 20th century, An-Nahda, and the development of music in the Levant in the 19th and 20th century, the commonalities of Levantine rural folk music. Maqam as a region-wide system and a musical form in Iraq. Similarities among folk music traditions of Iraq and neighboring countries. Musical exchanges among the various countries in the Levant. Example, between Syria and Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. Exchanges that address secular and sacred music, performance, and education. Urban and folk rhythms, melodic and rhythmic embellishment, the dimension of the dance. And of course, let's not forget that a huge repertoire of the music in the region is based on vocal music. So we would like to address this issue of poetry and music. And we cannot forget about education. In my speech to at the AUB graduation last June, I emphasized the importance of establishing higher institutions in arts, particularly for music. And I suggested that AUB, the American University of Beirut, should be a pioneer in establishing music department within university. Music department that not only addresses and teaches performance, composition, theory, but music department that also addresses music business in the region. If we look around in the region, we find most of the producers, most of the sound engineers, most of the composers are mostly Europeans, from England, from France, from the United States. So it would be very interesting to establish a music department that addresses all the aspects I just mentioned. So the last question would be, what is next for music in the Levant? Okay, we want to address what the future of this music in the Levant. So I would like to start with just introducing our friends here. I will start with Karim Rustom. Karim is a composer, a very well-known composer, not only as a Middle Eastern composer, but also Western classical composer of orchestras and choir. And he has been teaching at Tufts University in Boston. So Karim, if possible, to define some of the compositional forms in the Levant and your own contribution to music making. And I'm positive that music in our region contributed to and influenced Western music in one way or another. And I would like also to know your thoughts of the higher education and the future of music in the Levant.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I think one misconception that is kind of floats around a lot is that the exchange between the Levant and the West has always been kind of a one-way street, but it's for hundreds of years it's been very much a two-way street. In the first panel today, Philip Mansell talked about the consuls who came from European countries and stayed in Istanbul, and the value that they brought in many ways. But there was one particular consul, I believe of Polish origin, named Demetrius Cantemir, who lived in Istanbul for 20 years and actually became a very accomplished musician, so much so that he began composing in the traditional forms. He composed the Mevlevi Ayn, which is kind of a suite for the whirling dervishes, the Sufis of the time. But he also introduced notation to the region. As a matter of fact, a lot of what he notated of the Ottoman music at that time really survives until now and has become kind of a key for revivals over the recent decades. But one kind of very clear way that the influence kind of came back, it's reputed that one of his compositions in this traditional Ottoman style was seen by Mozart and influenced some of the dances in his opera, The Abduction from the Seraglio. But we see the influence of the sort of Levantine music and the Ottoman music in music of Beethoven, in music of Mussorgsky, and most recently, around 1966, an American composer named Charles Varainen wrote a piece for solo percussion called Janissary. And this leads me to the sort of next topic of exchange, the sort of the other way, was the Ottoman military bands helped to sort of bring instruments into the Western orchestra. So for instance, if you go to an orchestra and you hear these big cymbals crashing together, or a bass drum, or the tiny little triangle, or even the piccolo, all of those things originated in the Ottoman military bands or the Janissary band. And they were heard by composers, 18th century, 19th century composers, when apparently the Turkish Ottoman consuls would come into European cities and they would kind of have these very elaborate processions and bring the bands with them. So these sounds all kind of found their ways into the orchestra and are still very much part of the orchestra that we know today. So these are a couple of the two-way back and forth that the Levant has sort of helped the West and vice versa. As far as my music, you know, I think we all here living in the West but are from the Levant, we sort of inhabit this in-betweenness. You know, we're in between Syria, Lebanon, or what have you, and the US or Europe. So for me, that's the space that I inhabit personally. And if I need to compose something in a very traditional manner, that'll be something that I'm very happy to do. But if I have to also compose something in a very so-called Western manner, but the roots are never far. The roots are always there, and they kind of manifest themselves in one way or the other in the end result. I'll shift to higher education, what is needed. The last time I was in Syria, unfortunately, was a long time ago, 2008, but I had a residency at the Higher Conservatory of Music there. What I found were very talented young students, composers, performers who were open to jazz, they were open to hip hop, they were open to contemporary Western classical music and avant-garde things, and they were very, very thirsty to sort of incorporate these things in their sort of traditional language as well. But what was really needed there at the time was somebody to sort of give them direction, and I think clearly music business, the idea of how to survive professionally, how to publish your own music, how to produce a CD or that sort of thing, was very much lacking at the conservatory and was not part of that. And the other thing that was lacking, and I think that's desperately needed, is the use of technology in teaching all of these things. Those were also lacking. So I hope that these will be core parts of the music education of the future in the Levant.
Yes, we all hope so. Because basically this is the future of music teaching and the use of technology, which is, we experience this now in all over the traditional conservatories and higher education, especially at Berklee College of Music in Boston. And the topics of managing the music, marketing music, music therapy. For example, I was in Lebanon and I asked how many music therapists we have here in the country, and there is none. So how many film composers we have? None. So these are very important aspects in music that will definitely will help higher education to thrive. So one of the most component, or I should say several components in music of the Middle East at large, and particularly in Turkish music, Syrian and Lebanon and Egypt, I would say the concept of the Maqam system. And then we have also the Iqa system, which is the rhythmic modes. So we have the melodic modes and the rhythmic modes. Maqam system is the essence of this music simply because of a feature in the Maqam system that's called microtonality. okay? Microtonality, I just want to make it so easy for you to envision it. How many people here we have piano at home or have seen piano? Everybody, right? So what colors of keys we have in the piano? White and black. Imagine that we have white and neighbor black key on the piano, and somebody comes and insert a red key between the white and the black. And when you press on that red key, it produces the intermediate sound between the white and black. So this is microtonal sound. And imagine, let's use our imagination further, that we have green and blue keys around the red. Then we have 3 microtonal sounds between the white and black. So microtonality is the essence of the Maqam system. And while Western music, or let's say music in Europe, in the United States, jazz, Western classical, they use a system of harmony with very limitation in melody, and the harmony is the essence of expression. This is how we get emotionally driven, by listening to the harmony with the melody. So there is great harmony limitation in the melody, while music at the whole region, from India to Syria to Egypt to North Africa, they use the system which is the maqam with the microtonality. And the emotional drive and expression is within the microtonal qualities of the maqam. Also, there is the rhythmic modes, or the iqa'at. And here I would like to address Karim Nagy, who is one of the most talented percussionists and percussion and jazz teacher who goes all over the world to teach in workshops, assemblies, residencies. And Karim also came to the Arabic Music Retreat, which we have at the Mount Holyoke College. He taught there. So tell us, Karim, a little bit about the traditional urban folk regional rhythms across the Levant. And with the rhythm also, there is this art of embellishment, okay? So tell us what rhythm is and what's the embellishment quality within the rhythm.
It's a great question. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for including me. And through the study of rhythm, we can see and hear the continuity of music throughout the Levant, things that are common to the entire region, especially when we discuss urban rhythm, or what we sometimes would call classic rhythms. And they are composed of a downbeat and an upbeat, which we would call in Arabic dum and tek. And then when you start to get into the folkloric rhythms and traditional regional rhythms, you start to see the differences and hear the differences in that it's not totally homogeneous, but that each smaller group of people have a character. And may I play, please?
Please.
Thank you. So what we'd like to say is, for example, we can take the very first rhythm of the piece that we played today at the beginning, the Samai. And this has Turkish origins, but it's now acclaimed all over the Arab world and the Levant, and it's used very universally. And with the dums and teks, I would count it as 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But by itself, that's just the skeleton. We don't have any of the feeling or the imagination or the travel of it until we decorate. And this is the beauty of our music, is all of these small details between each. And that's what starts to give the character, and that each bar is different. And this is how we enjoy the music even more. So we can take all of these rhythms and we can find the classic, quote unquote, or the urban version, and then see how it's personified into the regions. So for example, I'll take this one, Wahdi. So in here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 2, 3, 4. So we call this a wahda by itself, with the embellishment. This is what makes it beautiful. Otherwise, it's just a plain t-shirt. This is with your logo and your decoration and cut up and cigarette burns and all the above. But then, we start to get into the regional versions of wahda. So the first thing we would do is we would speed it up. So for folkloric music, it's always tied to some kind of activity, a dance, a gathering. So here's the wahda, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, sped up. And now I would play it like you would hear in Lebanon or Syria with this decoration. You start to call that lef, right? And so, if you know the dabki line dance, which is popular over there, you know that people take step, right, lift, stomp, step, right, lift, stomp. So I've taken the rhythm, play 2 bars, and then accent the feet. Now if I go to Alexandria, Egypt, I would add this decoration. So here's the skeleton by itself. But in Alexandria, with the different dances, the hagalla, malaya laffa, I would add the double decoration. You hear this? And so this wouldn't work with dabki, would make them all nervous. So I would just play it like this, and then if I wanted to do the entire phrase of music, I would play 3 of them, and then accent at the end. So you hear that? And this is our music. Same root is we can play the shobi, which comes from Iraq, this long line dance. So we add the 3 dooms in the beginning. But it's still the same skeleton of left. So this is the commonality around the region. We have another group, Maqam, okay? So the urban version, which we would hear in all the different cities. Here's a skeleton. By itself, not much of anything, like a typewriter we're playing music. Well, other parts of it. I don't want to just show off our display, okay? Right, thank you. Of course, let's go back to dabki from Lebanon and Syria. So again, I'm going to trace the steps. Forward, back, stomp, stomp. So it's still this rhythm, the Maqam rhythm, but tracing the steps. Forward, for example, exactly like. Now for Egypt, we have the same rhythm, but it's played very quickly. We call this felahi, so farmer style. We don't want to be out there in the fields forever, so we speed it up. And finish quickly. And here would be our last major group, which is the Masmoudi group. So we would play this low. And this is our skeleton. 1, 2, and 5. The slower it is, the more you decorate. You can even decorate with the extra domes. But when you play it faster, we have the small Masmoudi, which you hear in our regional folk music all the time. Some people would call it beledi. Can you hear? You start to feel it, right? I can tell all of you are moving a little bit, clapping, even though I'm blinded. Don't resist. And let's finish, of course, with Turkey. And the beautiful thing that I saw in Turkey is that the audience can clap these odd rhythms, all right? And they're not thinking of it as an academic thing, but they feel it. So for example, one of the rhythms in Turkey would be the 7 beats. So rather than think of it as an odd number, it's 3 pulses, and the third one is longer, all right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you'd hear everybody there clapping. And you would feel encouraged. And then the final one, 9 beats. Do you think they know how to clap? I mean, we can do this in 20 seconds, right? Can you clap 4 times, but the 4th one is a little bit longer? Call this kashlama. 1, 2. A little faster on the last one. Not all the time fast, just the last one. Keep going, everyone. two more times. Last time. Thank you, everybody. These are our rhythms. Thank you very much. Shukran. 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 You can get to know our culture through this music. Thank you.
Yeah. Not chill.
5 minutes, exactly.
Let's move to, I would like to introduce Laith. Laith is an accomplished violin player, composer, was born in Iraq and grew up in Jordan, Amman. He came to United States where he studied, and now he's instructor and teacher at Tufts University and a performer. He performs all over the map. We were discussing the Iraqi region, which, geographically speaking, if you look at Iraq, it's really in between the eastern region that includes, let's say, Persia, and then you have India. And then on the western part of Iraq, you have Syria. In the north, you have Turkey. So the surrounding countries to Iraq influenced Iraqi music. So as I said, we have Iran, Syria, Turkey. How do you describe such influences, and did you experience an exchange as you played this music, or you listened to Persian, experience the Turkish music?
Thank you, Simone. So, despite my appearance and the red hair, I am Iraqi, and lived all my life in Jordan. I was born into a musical family. So while growing up in Amman, my parents would constantly, they would be hosting house concerts and inviting Iraqi musicians, very well-known Iraqi musicians, to perform, sing some songs after dinner and so on. And I would be learning these things while I was growing up. And soon when I started traveling and playing music with Syrians, with Turkish musicians, and so on, I started to hear Iraqi music or elements of Iraqi music in those different musics. And as Simone mentioned, geographically Iraq is in a very special place because of all the bordering countries. And when we look at the musical exchanges that have happened between these countries, we look at the regions, the rural regions in Iraq that are on the borders. For example, if we look in the eastern region of Iraq and the western region of Iran, Persia, the western region of Iran is occupied by Kurds, and the exchange in that region, the musical exchange and the rhythmical exchange, brought out the rhythm that we know today as Georgina. Would it be possible just to hear the rhythm? This rhythm, again, all my life I thought it was Iraqi, but then I met a friend of mine, an Iranian musician, who started playing it, and he told me, oh, this is an Iranian rhythm. I told him, hang on, I thought it was an Iraqi rhythm. And then the conversation started. Then again, with a Turkish musician, and they have a close enough rhythm, I said, where is this rhythm really from? And we look at, again, the rural regions and the folklore and how the musical exchanges happen there on the borders. And we see all these things kind of bleeding into the urban cities where they were researched, documented, and performed by artists and so on. So it became a significant part of what the Iraqi sound is. Similarly, when you look to the northern parts with Turkey, and there was a huge exchange between Iraq and Turkey, and of course musically, where there was exchange of teachers, of musicians who would teach in both countries, share the wealth of knowledge that they both had. But at the same time, there was also linguistic commonality, because a lot of, in our dialect, in the Iraqi dialect, we use a lot of Turkish words and phrases that we think that they are, sometimes growing up, think they're Arabic, but they're actually Turkish. And evidently these words and these phrases, and sometimes the poetry as well, would be used in the recitation of poems and songs in Iraq, musical poems. Even when you look to the west, to Syria, the repertoire that is shared between Iraq, and the musical repertoire and the songs that are shared between both these countries is so vast that, again, I have another story about these things. There's a very well-known song called Qadduk al-Mayas, and we all know it. I grew up playing it all the time and thinking it was a Syrian song. And I would present it in concerts as a Syrian song, and I would, in music halls and so on. And then one time I was rehearsing with a fellow Greek musician. He told me, Leith, we're going to play a song called Matyamu Matya. And I thought, excellent, this is a new song. Please play it for me because I want to learn it. He started playing the same melody of Qadduk al-Mayas. And I was thinking, I told him, excuse me, are you sure that that's what the song is called? Because this is really a Syrian song. And he said, no, it's a Greek song from Constantinople, and we learned it at that time, and we perform it daily. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And then actually talking with Kareem yesterday, we were thinking, also in Turkey, they play that song, and they have a different name for it. Mm. So that just shows you how the region in itself is so connected, and especially in the repertoire, the musical repertoire, that sometimes we don't even know where songs originate from and the music originates from. And that has been shared for a long period of time. And we're still finding these things to this day. It's not something that's already been discovered. There are still some songs that we are sometimes unsure where they are performed. Also, the piece that we played in the beginning, the Sama'i, it's a traditional composition, and it's an instrumental composition, and we perform it regularly. And one time I heard it being performed before a recitation, a musical recitation on an Iraqi recording, and they used that song. So there are millions and millions of examples of how there's so much shared music in that region, and the more that we study and look for it, the more it really amazes us and inspires us to look more into it.
I mentioned the word Maqam. Maqam, of course, it illustrates the model system, but also it illustrates a repertoire in Iraq. Could you please just clarify this?
Absolutely. As Simon mentioned, the word Maqam, the model system, is used by all the countries, Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, the microtonality of it. However, in Iraq, there is another term that the word Maqam means, and it means a musical form. Basically, improvisation is a big part of this music, of Maqam music, of the Levant music. And while it's a big part in Iraq, the Maqam repertoire, the musical form, is actually pre-composed, and it follows very strict guidelines for the performer to follow, so they can work their way through that performance, a reciter. And I was talking to Dr. Racy about this. I was talking about also Persian music. Mm-hmm. And we were just talking here today before the conference started, and he mentioned, we talked about both similarities between Persian and Iraqi, and they were identical. The idea of the Maqam as a pre-composed aspect, that sometimes even the poetry itself has to be, there's a certain poem that has to be read with that specific musical mode and that specific musical form for it to become valid. And it's a long tradition and serves a different kind of musical atmosphere. And it's something that Iraq had. And again, Iraq, to go back to finish it off, as the geographically where Iraq was, how it really served as a bridge between Persia and India all the way to Syria, and connected a lot of these elements into music. And people like Muhammad Abdul Wahab traveled to Iraq and listened to Iraqi Maqam. And the Iraqi Maqam also was performed at the conference in Egypt in 1932, which we will talk about. So again, many examples how Iraq served as a great bridge and a great element to expand Levantine music.
Thank you, Laith. Thank you. Dr. Racy is an ethnomusicologist, composer, performer. He was the head of the ethnomusic department at UCLA for many years, and still teaching there. Composed so many, the repertoire of his compositions is huge, and both in the Middle Eastern style and Western. Also, he infused his own music to, for example, the Kronos Quartet. He composed something for the Kronos Quartet where they have the two violins, viola and cello, and Dr. Racy added the nai, I guess, to the composition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we were talking about the 19th and 20th century, and then I asked Dr. Racy about the significance of such period and the concept of sacred and secular music and the spirituality of the music in that period. And the reason I'm talking about it because this is not a treatise, it's not a history that we read about, but we experience that period from recordings and performances. So, Dr. Racy, if you please address this period in the region and talk about sacred, secular music and the effects.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I'm honored to be invited to share information about the music. I'd like to start with a preface by saying that, repeating what was said already, I think it would be a great background for us today, that music transcends barriers of all types. The other thing was that there was a sort of a lingua franca in music with the late 19th century. There were many fantastic musicians began to shine and to influence other places in the Arab world, at least in North Africa included. Also, the introduction of commercial recordings. Around 1904, many companies from Europe, Britain, Europe, also some local companies started recording. And that also contributed to that sort of shared aesthetic. The people began to echo what they heard on records, phonograph records. Also learned so many things from these old phonographs that people had in their homes at the time. I really speak from both directions. One is from performance, certainly. The other thing is from ethnomusicology. This is a discipline that I teach at UCLA, and it looks at music from a cultural, philosophical, symbolic perspective. So I teach students the theory of that, but also I cover these countries that we come from, really. It's very interesting. These two things, the performance and the theoretical, became a combination in a book that I wrote titled Making Music in the Arab World, The Culture and Artistry of Tarab. This was published by Cambridge University, 2003. Now, the word Tarab really here is the key word for today. Tarab epitomizes, encapsulates the emotional dimension of Arab music, the music we will play today. The best translation probably for Tarab is ecstasy, for lack of any better translation, but it implies that people go into a sort of a state, a hal, in Persia call it hal, means state, and they go into an extraordinary form of transformation. When they hear the music, number of things. They react through verbal expressions. The Arab audience is more sort of extroverted. They talk to the musicians and they cheer them, but actually when they voice these expressions, they're not talking about the artists, but they talk about themselves, how they are really transformed. And some of them are very metaphoric. I collected some of these in my book. They say things like, oh, are you trying to kill us tonight? That's a great, great compliment, certainly. I heard another one from an Indian concert, actually. One Indian, I know this very, very wonderful musician came to Los Angeles and performed. When he done, walked to the front seat and saw a woman from India, and he said, "How did you like my performance tonight?" She said, "I wasn't here." I said, "Well, I saw you sitting on that chair." He said, "Yeah, I was sitting on that chair, but I wasn't here." But it took him a while to know this is a fantastic compliment. So we all, I learned that from, I should have put it in my book, but that came after I wrote the book. Those things that my colleagues talked about, they all contribute to the state of Tarab. The Maqam, ornaments, all these things, when they come together, they produce that state called Tarab. Then people go to some kind of alter state of consciousness. They're really very interesting. That affects the audience and the performers. The audience explain that also metaphorically. They feel like they're out of their body feeling. They feel that they lost sense of time. They could say, "Oh, I could sit here till morning. I just want to continue to listen to this music." They also other things of introspection, and they talk about how they felt that evening and things like that. Now, for the musicians, very interesting. Musicians also go into a trance. They call it sultana. It's interesting. Sultana means, what it really implies is that you gain power. You became very, very powerful. They call if musician has sultana, he's like a king. No, he does something fantastic. We never heard him do this before. But what he did tonight was like magic. It's a very creative state that musicians use. But how do they get it? First of all, they have to be good musicians. Everybody can do it. Also, they have to be, they call it ruh, means soul. They have soul. And they call it ihsas, feeling. If that musician has these qualities, then he or she can do a kind of exercise to go into that state. What they do is, in the old days, in Egypt, for example, they used to bring the accompanist and string and keep playing until the mutrib, or the musician, goes into that state. Okay, I like that maqam. Tonight is Hijaz. Some people say, well, why that? Well, some people, the falak, these zodiacs shining, and this honored for that. There was the cosmology. They connected the maqamat with the zodiacs and things like that. So until probably 100 years ago, they say, well, what tonight, this maqam we're playing it because we tried the others, they didn't sound good. Or they played a terrible oud, and that night sounded fantastic. They cannot understand. Well, maybe some zodiac or something like that. But I copied, I documented all these things. Very interesting. The other thing that's very important is the audience. The audience in these countries where we come from, they are part of the making, of the music process, really, because they didn't sit and do nothing, but they have to respond, and that rapport is it's like a cycle. I worked with, I introduced Sabah Fakhri and many others, and he told me that, I look at the audience, and I look at people who really look like they're really good listeners. They call it Sami'a, from Sama'. It reminds us of Al-Ghazali's Adab al-Sama', and this is the Sufi treatises. and then becomes a rapport. He would look at those samiha, and you could see the body language, the percussion, the impression on their faces. They're usually subdued, but really very powerful the way they give the signal. It's like, I think Ghazali used to say, it's like being, a good Sufi is someone who's looks so calm on the outside, but inside of him there's a fire burning. So these are the good listeners. They don't have to do much, but you can tell that they're really being transformed. Again, here the relationship is depends so much on metaphors. They begin to, again, they say if that musician has sultana here, he can or she can do things that they cannot even explain because that music came through them. They don't know what happened. Don't ask me to play it again because I cannot do it again. And sometimes when we go to, we've done it probably in studios, and we do one piece, the first take, and something we don't like, and they make us repeat it about 7, 8, 10 times, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And we go back to the first rendition was the best. The one interesting also metaphor that really is interesting is that they try to explain Tarab or Sultana as these old medieval actually encyclopedias, and they say it's a combination of pleasure and pain. It's neither pain nor pleasure, but when you mix them together, it becomes Tarab. Interesting. But I began to call it like delectable melancholy, and when the pain becomes beautiful. It's very interesting, and so many songs talk about the bulbul, the nightingale, the way it sings. It's like crying, but that crying is so beautiful. It's very, very complex kind of combination. The other thing that I also found very interesting is the person who acquires that sultana feels nothingness, like you're out of anything. You just becomes Sufis get annihilation. In other words, you become nothing, but by becoming nothing, you become everything. When you surrender, you become powerful. It's very empowering that. And I think Sufis also talk about that. And began interesting, I found out that the Sufis also, the annihilation also brings you more closer to the divine, because really you become part of the whole thing. You emptied yourself to be filled with something else, I suppose. But then I got interested in Sufism because I thought Sufism really, they really resonate. The mysticism in that part of the world and the musical ecstasy. And began to think, look, Jalaluddin Rumi established the Sufi sect in the 13th century in Konya. And he wrote a beautiful poem about the reed flute, the nai. It was written in Persian, and now people sing it in Iran and Turkey and so on. And then began to think, my gosh, what's with that, with the flute? Well, the flute is made from cane. And began to think, cane is the plant that close all we come from, close by the riversides, and people make musical instruments from cane. So, and back to the poem. When the poem is played, it cries, it weeps, because playing that sound made it so nostalgic to the garden where it came from. And becomes a beautiful metaphor for the human also. When the music is played, they go into that state and become eager to merge with the divine. So it's very interesting, the symbolism. So I brought a couple of instruments made from cane. If you allow me to demonstrate them. Did I?
Just by
I could do that.
We have to have the permission because we are over time.
Yeah. Okay.
So if we are okay with it, yes, please.
Okay. This was, I bought it in a tourist shop in Beirut. But, see, this instrument has a very sentimental sound, almost like a mother singing for the baby, and it's like love.
Anyway, I would like to thank Karim, Nagy, Dr. Racy, Late Siddiq, Karim Rustom for this presentation, and we are proud to be part of this, and look forward to participating in the coming panels and the concert this evening. Thank you so much for attending, and